The dollar-short rain fell hard on the streets of Mountain View that morning. Sundar Pichai walked quickly, his thin jacket doing little to keep him dry. He had just come from a long meeting where everyone spoke louder than they listened. His head was full of numbers, charts, and worries about tomorrow's presentation. Yet none of that mattered at this moment. What mattered was the quiet voice inside him that whispered something was missing in his life. Though he could not yet name it, he stopped at a small corner store. It was warm inside and smelled of fresh bread. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, gave him a polite smile. Sundar nodded, his mind still elsewhere. He picked up a bottle of water, a sandwich, and a pack of gum. He needed to get back to work quickly. But as he approached the counter, something strange happened. He reached into his pocket for his wallet. It wasn't there. He checked again, nothing. He remembered leaving it on his desk. His cheeks grew warm as he realized he didn't have enough cash in his other pocket. He placed what he had, 3 crumpled bills and a few coins on the counter. Cashier counted the money and looked up. "You're $1 short," she said gently. The words hung in the air. It was just $1, but Sundar stood there frozen, unable to move. He felt everyone behind him watching. In that instant, he wasn't a CEO or a powerful figure anymore. He was just a man who didn't have enough to pay for his lunch. The man behind him, wearing a hoodie and earbuds, shifted impatiently. Someone else muttered under their breath. Sundar could feel the weight of their eyes, the quiet judgment in the air. His hands trembled slightly as he searched his pockets one more time, hoping to find the missing dollar. But of course it wasn't there. Then he looked up at the cashier again. Her eyes were kind but distant, like she had seen this happen 1,000 times before. She didn't offer to cover him. She just waited. A long moment passed before Sundar finally spoke. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I'll put the sandwich back." He reached for the sandwich, but before he could take it off the counter, a hand appeared next to his. "Don't," said a deep voice behind him. He turned to see an older man with a lined face and heavy coat. The man dropped a dollar bill on the counter without a word. Then he turned and walked out of the store, the door slamming shut behind him. The cashier blinked, clearly surprised. Sundar picked up his things, murmured thanks, and walked out too. But the man was already gone. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was gray but calm. Sundar stood there, holding his sandwich, feeling something strange in his chest. He didn't know why such a small thing, a stranger giving him $1, shook him so deeply. He thought of the people who worked for him. People who struggled to pay bills, people who stayed quiet when life got hard. He thought of his mother back home in India, who used to skip meals so he could eat. He stood there a long time, staring at the wet sidewalk, and he noticed something odd. A piece of paper was sticking out of the sandwich wrapper. He opened it. Slowly. It wasn't a receipt. It was a note written in small, careful letters that, if you want to understand what really matters, follow method was no name, no number, just those words. He turned the paper over and saw a single address. Written on the back, it was a street he didn't recognize. Sundar's hands grew cold as he stared at the note. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Why had the man left this for him? Who was he? And what did he mean by what really matters? Sundar looked up at the sky, the wind picking up again. He folded the note and put it in his pocket. He took a step toward the street and hailed a cab. But his mind was spinning. He had no idea that what he was about to discover at that address would change everything. He thought he knew about himself. And as the cab pulled away, a shadowy figure watched him from across the street. Unseen, waiting for him to make his choice. Asteriskly addressly. Cab's engine purred low as it rolled through narrow streets Sundar had never noticed before. The glass of the window was cool against his temple as he leaned slightly, staring out at the world passing by. The buildings grew older, the sidewalks cracked, and the neat rows of manicured lawns gave way to wild patches of grass and paint chipped. Porches. Every turn of the cab seemed to take him further from the familiar rhythm of Silicon Valley. deeper into a quiet that felt both unsettling and strangely comforting. He unfolded the note in his pocket again and stared at the address. The letters were smudged from the rain, but still clear enough to read. He whispered it to himself under his breath, feeling the words on his tongue, as though the syllables themselves held some kind of power. His heart beat harder the closer they got, and not because of the neighborhood's unfamiliarity, but because of a growing sense irrational, yet undeniable, that this moment was more than chance. Stopped the cab abruptly at the corner of a narrow alleyway. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror but didn't speak. Sundar looked out at the destination. There was no sign, no number on the door. Just a faded wooden storefront with dust on the windows and a single light bulb glowing faintly inside. He paid the driver, stepped out, and the cab drove away, leaving him standing alone in the silence of the street. He hesitated. He could feel the weight of the note in his pocket pressing against him like a question he couldn't yet answer. Finally, he drew a slow breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The air was warm but heavy, smelling faintly of old wood and something he couldn't quite name. Maybe incense, maybe something older. The room was small and cluttered, lined with shelves of worn books, faded photographs, and little trinkets stacked in careless piles. At the far end of the room sat the man from the store, the same man who had handed him the $1. He was seated at a wooden table, hands folded, neatly, as though he had been expecting Sundar all along. His coat hung on the back of the chair, revealing a dark shirt beneath, and his eyes, those deep, unflinching eyes, lifted to meet Sundar's without surprise. "You came?" the man said softly for a moment. Sundar didn't know how to answer. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but none of them came out. Instead, he nodded, feeling suddenly aware of how loud his own breathing sounded in the stillness. The man gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit," he said simply. Sundar sat, his fingers resting awkwardly on the edge of the table. He opened his mouth to speak, but the man raised a hand gently, as if to say not yet. He reached under the table and pulled out a small rectangular wooden box. He placed it on the table and slid it towards Sundar. "Open it," he murmured. Sundar's hands felt clumsy as he lifted the lid. Inside was an old photograph, yellowed with age. He picked it up and stared at it. The picture showed a young boy standing barefoot in the middle of a crowded street, holding a loaf of bread in both hands. His clothes were ragged, his hair messy, but his face was lit by a smile so pure, so unguarded, that it almost hurt to look at. Behind the boy stood a man taller, older, wearing a heavy coat very much like the one now draped behind the chair. "That's me," the man said quietly. Sundar's eyes darted from the photo to the man and back. Again. The resemblance was there, but faint, like a ghost of a memory trying to surface. And that, the man continued, was the first time someone gave me more than food. They gave me dignity. They gave me a reason to keep going. Sundar said, the photo down carefully, his mind racing. "But why me?" he asked finally. His voice cracked a little, though he didn't know why. The man smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because once someone did the same for. You've just forgotten." Those words landed heavy, like stones sinking in water. Sundar's chest tightened as images began to flicker unbidden in his mind. A memory of his mother slipping a coin into his hand when he was too afraid to ask. Of a stranger in a train station who had offered him water when he thought no one. Notice him crying. Memories he had buried beneath years of boardrooms and schedules and polished speeches. The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Sundar's. "You forgot," he said again, more softly this time. "But it's still there. And now you have to choose." Sundar blinked, confused. "Choose what?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. "This," he said, "is the next step, but it won't be easy. And once you take it, you can't go back." Sundar stared at the folded paper, feeling the weight of the room closing in on him. The quiet hum of the single light bulb overhead seemed deafening now. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and picked up the paper. He unfolded it slowly. Inside was another address. This one written in the same careful handwriting, but with 3 words underneath, bring nothing else. He looked up at the man, but the chair across from him was empty now. The man was gone. The air in the room had changed. It felt colder, sharper somehow. Sundar stood up quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. He stepped outside and found the street completely empty. No cars, no people, not even the faint sound of traffic in the distance. Just silence. He looked down at the note in his hand, feeling a strange mix of fear and something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But as he began to walk, he didn't notice the figure watching him from the rooftop across the street. A figure who held a small black notebook and was writing something down in it, glancing up at him every few moments. And as Sundar turned the corner toward his new destination, the figure whispered under his breath, just loud enough for no one to hear. He has no idea what's waiting for him. Asterisk the door without a lock. The streets felt different now. Sundar walked without noticing the chill that settled in his bones, or the way the faint light of the sun had disappeared behind heavy clouds. In his hand, the second note felt heavier than it should, as though the 3 words at the bottom, bring nothing else, carried a weight far beyond their size. Every few steps, he glanced at the address again, more out of nervous habit than any real need, because he already felt he knew exactly where he was going. He turned corners, it seemed, to bend the rules of distance. The streets no longer lined up the way he expected. At times, he could swear he walked for minutes, only to end up right where he started. His breath began to fog in the air, and his hands grew stiff with cold. Yet he kept going, 1 foot after the other, pulled forward by something stronger than curiosity, stronger even than fear. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, he came to a narrow alley he had never seen before. The walls on either side rose high and leaned, shutting out most of the light. The ground was wet with a thin film of water, though no rain had fallen since he left the first address. At the far end of the alley stood a single door. It was wooden and weathered, cracked in places, but something about it made his chest tighten. He stopped a few feet away, staring at the door. There was no lock, no handle, just a faint symbol etched into the wood, a circle around a single line, simple and strange. Though it stirred something unnameable in the back of his mind, he reached out and pressed his palm flat against the wood. The door swung open silently, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. He stepped inside. The air was warmer here, but heavy, thick with the smell of earth and something faintly sweet. The hallway stretched on and on, lined with doorways on either side, each one closed, each one marked with a different symbol carved into its surface. His footsteps echoed softly on the floor, and though he tried to move quietly, he felt as though the whole place could hear him. He passed one door, then another, then another. Every few moments, he thought he heard a faint sound, a whisper, or the creak of wood, or maybe just his own heartbeat. But each time he paused to listen, the silence rushed back in, even louder than before. Finally, at the end of the hallway, he found another door. This one was different. It was made of dark metal instead of wood, and it bore no symbol at all. Instead, a single sentence had been scratched into its surface in hurried, uneven letters. Only those who remember may enter. His breath caught. He pressed his hand to the door, but it didn't move. He tried again, this time pushing harder. But it held firm. And then he heard it, a faint voice behind him. You can't open it because you still don't remember. He spun around, but the hallway behind him was empty. Who's there? He called out, his voice trembling despite his effort to keep it steady. The voice came again, softer now, closer. Look, it said. Sundar froze as his eyes were drawn to the wall beside the door. At first, it was just stone, rough and gray. But slowly, shapes began to emerge, faint outlines, like chalk drawings coming into focus. The first image showed a young boy sitting on a dirt floor, cradling a broken toy in his hands. Sundar stared at it, feeling something stirred deep inside his chest. The next image showed the same boy, older now, thinner, standing outside a classroom, peering in through the window while other children laughed inside. Another step down the wall, and there he was again, kneeling next to his mother as she mended a torn shirt, both of them quiet, their hands moving in tired rhythm. Sundar raised his hand and touched the wall gently, his fingers tracing the outlines of the boy's face. The images were pieces of his own, past, moments he had not thought of in years. Moments he had buried beneath ambition and responsibility and the relentless climb of success. His throat tightened as the memories came rushing back. The sting of hunger, the shame of wearing the same shoes until they fell apart, the warmth of his mother's hand squeezing his when the world seemed too big. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he whispered into the empty hallway, "I remember." The metal door behind him creaked. He turned slowly. The sentence on the door had changed. Now it read, "You may enter." He swallowed hard and pushed the door open. Beyond it was a vast, circular room bathed in golden light. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they held countless objects, toys, letters, pieces of clothing, photographs, each one carefully placed as though waiting for someone to claim it. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, and sitting in the chair was the man from the store. The same man who had given him the $. But now he looked older, his face lined with sorrow and wisdom. He met Sundar's gaze and nodded slowly. "You've come far," the man said. His voice low and steady. Sundar stepped closer, still trying to take in the enormity of the room around him. "What is this place?" he asked. The man's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "This," he said, "is where people come to find what they've lost. Their humility, their kindness, their respect for others. Everything the world took from them while they were busy trying to be something else." Sundar swallowed, feeling the truth of those words settle into him like a weight. "And what happens now?" he asked quietly. The man rose from the chair and placed a hand on Sundar's shoulder. "Now," he said, "you must choose what you will carry forward and what you will leave behind." The golden light in the room began to shift, growing warmer, brighter. Sundar felt his knees weaken under the weight of it all. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, the man leaned close and whispered something into his ear, a single sentence that made Sundar's eyes go wide and his breath catch in his throat. But before he could respond, the man stepped back, and the golden light flared so brightly that Sundar had to shut his eyes. When he opened them again, the room was empty. The chair, the man, the shelves, gone. In his hand, he now held a small black notebook, the same kind this shadowy figure on the rooftop had been writing in earlier. Its cover cool and smooth against his palm. On the first page, written in the same careful handwriting as the notes before, were just 3 words: "Find the boy." Sundar stood alone, now in the silence of the room, the words echoing in his mind, his hands trembling as he realized this was only the beginning, and somewhere far above him, unseen, the figure from the rooftop closed his own notebook, smiled faintly, and whispered into the dark, "Let's see if he's ready." The boy in the photograph. Silence in the room was so complete that Sundar could hear the faint sound of his own pulse in his ears. He stood there for what felt like a long time, the small black notebook heavy in his hands, its smooth cover cool against his skin. He turned it over, hoping to find something more, an address, a name, a clue, but there was nothing else written. Just those 3 quiet words on the first page. "Find the boy." His eyes drifted to the floor, where the chair had stood only moments ago. There was no trace of it now, no sign the man had ever been there. The room smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, as if the air itself had been scorched before he arrived. The light, too, had changed. It was no longer golden, but pale and cold, throwing long shadows against the empty walls. He took a breath, closed the notebook carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He felt the faintest tremor in his hands as he turned back toward the metal door, which stood open as though waiting for him. On the other side of the door, the hallway was different. The wooden doors with strange symbols were gone, replaced by cracked walls and broken tiles underfoot. It smelled faintly of rain now, though the air was dry. Each step he took echoed louder than the last dot when he emerged from the building. He found himself not in the quiet street he remembered, but in a wide, empty square lit by the dim light of dusk. All around him stood buildings that looked abandoned. Windows boarded, paint peeling, whole floors sagging like weary shoulders. Faint laughter and whispers seemed to float in the air. Though he could see no one, he looked down at the notebook in his pocket and whispered the words to himself. Find the boy. But who was the boy? The one from the photograph. The boy with the bread and the wide and guarded smile. His feet moved before his mind decided where to go. He began to walk toward the far end of the square, where a faint light glowed, above the doorway of a small shop. As he approached, he saw that the window was cracked and fogged from the inside. Painted on the glass in faded white letters were the words "Photo Studio" inside. The air was warm and thick with the smell of chemicals. Old photographs covered the walls, black and white portraits of children, couples, entire families staring solemnly from behind glass. Some of the pictures had names written at the bottom. Others just dates that went back decades. Asterisk at the back of the shop stood a man in a faded vest, his sleeves rolled up, his hands busy arranging a series of photographs. In a wooden frame, he looked up as Sundar entered, his eyes sharp and knowing. You're late, the man said softly. Sundar stopped in his tracks, unsure how to answer. You know me? The man gave a faint smile. I know why you're here. Everyone who comes through that door is here for the same reason. Sundar felt his heart quicken. I'm looking for a boy, he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. The man nodded. You're closer than you think? He turned toward a wall behind him and gestured for Sundar to follow. There, displayed in a large frame, was the same photograph Sundar had seen in the wooden box earlier. The boy holding the loaf of bread, barefoot in the street, his smile bright against the shadows. But this time, Sundar noticed something he hadn't before. In the corner of the photograph, just behind the boy, was another figure, faint and blurry, almost hidden in the dark dot. It was himself. He stumbled back a step, his breath catching in his throat. That's impossible, he murmured. The man in the vest nodded calmly, as though he'd expected this reaction. You've met him before, he said. You just forgot. Sundar stared at the photograph, his mind racing. It was him, younger, thinner, but unmistakably him, standing in the shadows, watching the boy. His own eyes in the picture looked hollow, almost frightened, as though he too had been searching for something. Who is he? Sundar whispered, his voice cracking. The man's gaze grew serious now. He is what you left behind, he said simply. And if you don't find him, you will never leave this place. The words settled heavy in the room. Where do I find him? Sundar asked, his voice quiet but firm. The man gestured toward a narrow door at the back of the shop. Follow the river, he said. It's the only way. Sundar took a deep breath, tore his eyes away from the photograph, and walked toward the door. On the other side was a narrow path that sloped down into a valley. The air was colder now, and he could hear the faint sound of water rushing somewhere. Below, he followed the path carefully, the stone slick underfoot, his hands trailing along the rough wall to steady himself as he rounded a bend. The valley opened before him. A river wound its way through the rocks, its surface shimmering with strange, silvery light, and there, standing on a small wooden bridge that stretched across the river, was the boy. He wore the same ragged shirt and bare feet as in the photograph, his hand clutching the loaf of bread, his gaze fixed on Sundar with quiet intensity. Sundar froze. The boy didn't move. After what felt like forever, Sundar finally stepped closer, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I've been looking for you, he called out. Though his voice cracked with doubt, the boy didn't answer. Sundar took another step, then another, until he stood at the edge of the bridge. The boy was only a few feet away now, but something in his eyes made Sundar hesitate, a mixture of innocence and sadness, as though he already knew what Sundar was going to say. I don't know how to do this, Sundar admitted, his shoulders sinking still. The boy said nothing, but then, slowly, he extended his hand, small, dirty, trembling, and held it out to Sundar without thinking. Sundar reached for it. The moment their hands touched, the river beneath them roared to life, glowing brighter, the air around them pulsing with warmth. Sundar gasped as memories rushed back in waves. Laughter, tears, hunger, hope, all the moments he had buried to become the man he thought he needed to be. He squeezed the boy's hand tighter, and for the first time, the boy spoke. "You're not done yet." Before Sundar could answer, the wooden bridge shuddered underfoot. A sharp crack split the air, and the boards beneath them began to splinter. The boy's hand slipped from his, and Sundar lunged forward, trying to grab him, but the boy was already falling toward the roaring water below. Double quotes now. Sundar shouted, his own feet sliding as the bridge gave way completely. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the boy's wide eyes staring up at him through the churning water, his lips forming words that Sundar couldn't quite hear, and then he plunged into the cold, dark river. The sound of rushing water swallowing everything, asterisk the mirror and the storm, the water was colder than anything Sundar had ever felt. It swallowed him whole in an instant, the shock knocking the breath from his lungs and filling his ears with a deafening roar. He tumbled through the current, arms flailing, legs kicking at nothing as the river dragged him down into its depths. He opened his eyes for just a moment and saw only darkness streaked with faint silver light, like moonlight shattered into 1,000 pieces. His chest burned as he fought to hold on to what little air he had left. Panic surged through him, sharp and blinding, until his hands found something, a slick stone, jagged but solid, and he clung to it with everything he had. He pulled himself upward, inch by inch, his fingers raw and trembling, until his head finally broke the surface. He coughed and gasped for air, choking on the icy spray, his body shivering violently. The river's current was still strong, but he managed to drag himself to the bank, collapsing onto the muddy shore, his chest heaving, his whole body aching for a long time. He lay there on his back, staring up at the strange sky above. It was neither day nor night, but a shifting canvas of gray and gold, with clouds that moved too quickly, curling into shapes he couldn't quite understand. The boy was gone. Sundar pushed himself to his knees, his clothes heavy and clinging to his skin. He looked around wildly, calling out, "Where are you?" His voice cracked, swallowed quickly by the restless wind. There was no answer. Only the river still rushing by, quieter now, but just as merciless. He stood slowly, his legs weak beneath him, and saw a faint path winding away from the riverbank, lined with sharp stones and shadowed by tall, bare trees, though the cold bit at him and his body screamed for rest. He knew he had to keep moving. Something inside him, that quiet, stubborn voice, told him that turning back was no longer an option. The path climbed steeply, and the higher he went, the stranger the world around him became. The trees seemed to whisper to each other, their branches bending low over the trail. The air grew thick with mist, and the ground glowed faintly beneath his feet, as though lit from below. After what felt like hours, the path ended at the mouth of a cave, its entrance framed by jagged rocks that seemed to lead inward, forming a crude arch. Above the entrance, carved deeply into the stone, was a single word he almost didn't want to read. Truth. But he stood there, staring at it, his breath coming in uneven bursts. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the wet stone. A man he barely recognized anymore, hollow-eyed, shoulders hunched, lips trembling. But he stepped inside anyway. The air in the cave was dry and warm, almost suffocating. The walls were smooth and cold to the touch, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. He followed the narrow tunnel until it opened suddenly into a vast chamber. The space was lit by a soft, unnatural glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the center of the chamber stood a single, enormous mirror, tall enough to touch the ceiling, wide enough to reflect the entire room. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though alive. He approached it slowly, feeling the weight of his own footsteps, his pulse thudding loud in his ears. When he stood before the mirror, he saw himself, but not as he was now. The man in the reflection stood taller, his suit immaculate, his hands folded calmly before him. His eyes glimmered with confidence and certainty. He was the man Sundar had worked so hard to become, the CEO, the leader, the success story. But then the reflection began to change. The man's eyes darkened. His smile twisted into something sharp and cold. The light behind him faded, replaced by shadows that reached forward like grasping hands. Sundar took an instinctive step back. But the figure in the mirror stepped forward. You've spent your life running from him. The figure said in a voice that was his own, but deeper, crueler. Who? Sundar asked, though his throat felt tight. From the boy. The figure replied. The reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Sundar could see now that the figure's other hand was clenched tight around something, a small loaf of bread, crumbling in his grip. You left him behind, the figure said softly. You buried him to become me. Sundar felt something in his chest crack, a sharp, painful awareness of how much he had abandoned to climb higher. How many quiet moments of kindness and humility he had traded for power and applause. I didn't mean to, he whispered. The figure in the mirror smiled faintly. But you did. It said. The air around the chamber grew colder, and the mirror began to hum, low and deep. As cracks appeared in its surface. The figure in the reflection pressed harder against the glass, his dark eyes glinting with something Sundar couldn't name. Anger, sorrow, hunger. The voice came again, louder now. Find him, or become me. Forever. The mirror shattered. Asterisk shards of glass flew through the air, and Sundar threw his arms up to shield himself. When he lowered them, the chamber was gone. He stood now in the middle of a vast plain under a storm-black sky. Lightning forked in the distance, and the wind howled, carrying the faint sound of children's laughter, soft at first, then louder, sharper, almost mocking. Ahead of him stood the boy. He was farther away this time, standing at the edge of the plain, his bare feet sinking into the wet earth, his head tilted slightly as though listening for something. Sundar called out to him, but the wind swallowed his voice. The boy turned and ran. Asterisk without thinking. Sundar ran after him, his feet slipping on the wet ground, his lungs burning with each breath. Asterisk. The storm above raged louder, and the earth beneath him began to crack. Deep fissures opening as though the world itself was splitting apart. But he didn't stop. Even as the rain poured down and the boy vanished into the dark. Sundar kept running, his eyes fixed ahead, his hands outstretched, and as the ground gave way beneath his feet and he fell forward into the roaring blackness below, he heard the boy's voice, faint, almost drowned by the storm, whisper one final word, remember. And then everything went dark. Asterisk, the choice of there was no falling anymore. No wind, no storm, no sound. Sundar opened his eyes slowly and found himself lying on a smooth floor of polished stone. The air was warm, almost too warm, and filled with a faint scent of sandalwood and ash. Above him stretched a vast ceiling of black marble, veined, with thin streaks of gold that shimmered faintly in the stillness. He pushed himself upright and looked around. He was standing in a great hall now, silent and empty, though it felt anything but lifeless. The walls were covered with hundreds of narrow alcoves, and inside each alcove glowed a single flickering light, soft, delicate, and somehow alive. Like little souls caught in lanterns. At the far end of the hall, there was a single doorway framed by tall columns of dark stone. A faint light poured through it, golden and bright, as though the sun itself waited beyond. And in the center of the doorway stood the boy. He looked smaller now, more fragile. His bare feet barely touched the floor, and his head was bowed slightly, as if the weight of his journey was finally too much. In his hands he still held the loaf of bread, but it was crumbling now, little pieces falling through his fingers to scatter across the stone. Sundar took a step forward. But his own legs felt heavy, as though each footfall carried years of everything. He had done every ambition, every choice, every regret, all pressed into his bones. Why do you keep running from me? The boy asked softly, his voice breaking the silence like glass. Sundar swallowed hard, but couldn't find an answer. The boy lifted his head now, and his eyes, dark and deep, full of pain and defiance and longing, locked with Sundar's. You forgot me, the boy said louder this time. You left me behind when you climbed higher. You promised you wouldn't. The words struck Sundar harder than any storm or river or mirror could. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a whisper. I thought I had to. He said. The boy shook his head slowly, his fingers tightening around the crumbling bread. You didn't, he said. You just chose to. The weight of the truth sank into Sundar's chest like a stone. He took another step, then another until he stood right in front of the boy. He knelt down, his knees pressing into the cold stone, and reached out his hands. I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling now. I remember. I remember everything. The nights we went without food. The shame of standing outside classrooms. The way you smiled even when there was nothing to smile about. I remember you. The boy's face softened slightly, and for the first time, a faint smile returned to his lips. Small and hesitant, but real. Then take me with you, he said simply. Sundar hesitated, feeling a chill run down his spine. He knew instinctively what it meant. To take the boy meant leaving behind the polished figure he had built, the confident CEO, the man with sharp suits and quick answers. To take the boy meant embracing every scar, every crack, every quiet truth he had tried so hard to hide. He looked past the boy toward the golden light in the doorway. He could see faint shapes beyond it, the outlines of people, maybe memories, waiting for him. Slowly, he reached out both hands. The boy placed the loaf of bread, what little was left of it, into Sundar's palms. The crumbs fell through his fingers and scattered across the floor, but the warmth of it remained. The boy stepped closer and leaned his forehead against Sundar's chest, and then, just like that, he dissolved into him, a soft rush of light and warmth that filled Sundar from head to toe. For the first time in years, Sundar felt whole. The hall around him began to fade now. The alcoves dimmed. The columns dissolved. The marble floor beneath him cracked and gave way to something else. Soft soil, green grass, a warm breeze that carried the scent of rain and earth. When he opened his eyes fully, he was standing outside again, in the middle of a quiet field, under a sky painted with the colors of dawn. And there, just a few steps away, stood the man from the store. He was leaning casually against a tree, arms crossed, his faint smile unchanged. You found him? The man said. Sundar nodded, his throat tight. And now? Sundar asked. The man tilted his head, studying him for a long moment. Now, the man said, you choose what to do with him. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You can leave all this behind and go back to who you were. No one will know what happened here. You'll wake up tomorrow and everything will be as it was. The meetings, the speeches, the applause, the power. Sundar swallowed, feeling the words press into him like cold iron. Or, the man continued, his gaze steady. You can keep the boy with you. Live every day with him at your side. But it won't be easy. You'll feel everything again. The pain, the humility, the kindness, the gout. You won't be able to look away anymore. Sundar closed his eyes for a long moment. He thought of his mother's hands. He thought of standing barefoot outside a classroom window. He thought of the stranger who gave him $1 when he needed it most. And he thought of the boy's quiet smile on the bridge when he opened his eyes. He met the man's gaze without flinching. I'll keep him, Sundar said firmly. For the first time, the man smiled fully, a smile that was almost proud. Good, he said softly. You're ready. He placed a hand on Sundar's shoulder and leaned close, whispering something into his ear. Words so quiet Sundar barely heard them. And then, before Sundar could ask what he meant, the man stepped back and faded into the morning light, his figure dissolving like smoke. The field grew brighter, the wind warmer, Sundar looked down at his hands. The boy's hands. Their hands? Together, Dot, and in the distance, faint but clear, he heard laughter, not mocking this time, but bright and free, carrying across the field like a promise. He took his first step forward, the grass cool beneath his feet, the air filling his lungs with something that felt like hope, Dot, and the world beyond. The field was waiting, with all its noise, its demands, its judgment. He knew now that he could face it, because he was no longer alone, Dot, and somewhere, perhaps just beyond sight. The boy's quiet voice rose again. Carried on the breeze, Dot, remember who you are. And Sundar kept walking, the sound of his own heartbeat steady now, the boy's smile alive inside him, as the dawn finally broke across the sky.